As the door opened, Philip Camley said, "I believe you have a sitting room to let." And the echoing overtones from his 3 previous utterances of this remark that day giggled through his brain. "Yes," said the person who opened it, "we have. Will you step in?" As he entered, Camley slyly, but fairly comprehensively, examined him. That it was a Helme at all was a surprise, for the other 3 had been beady-eyed hers of that vague age between 50 and senility, so hard to judge precisely in the case of landladies and other drab females. This person suggested dilapidated anemic gentility, a thing of aged sports coats and grey bags, and thin battered face, grotesquely hairy with its whiskers and drooping moustache. Grey and brown played you perfectly, thought Camley, but I can't remember the piece. He was about 60. A small grimy mongrel had come to the door with him. "Will you come this way?" said this dim, carpet-slippered ghost of a gent, and led the way up 2 flights of stairs to the first floor, and opened a door on the right. Camley got another shock, and a far greater one, when he saw the room. A brief experience had taught him you got no bridal suite for 12 and 6 per week, but the unexpired portion of some moribund down-at-heel sticks of furniture, torn lace curtains, a bed with a mattress by courtesy of Wormwood Scrubs, and a good portion of the dust of ages. But this apartment was almost lavish, almost grandiose, with its heavily timbered glossy furniture, spacious brass bed, thick carpet, and china parrots on the mantelpiece. It looked like 25 shillings at least, but some dissembling was indicated. He went to a window and looked out over a small oblong garden, a patch of matted, scrubby lawn, a staggering pergola, 4 mangled plane trees, 2 stained chipped stone urns, ending in a small jungle of bushes, tins, bottles, and birdlime. 2 cats were slowly swearing at each other on a wall. "All right," said Camley. "I'll take it for a fortnight, and we'll see how we get on. 12 and 6, I understand?" "Yes," replied the old man. "I hope you'll be comfortable. I'm sorry my wife couldn't show you round, but she's somewhat of an invalid, and this is one of her bad days." Not one of your best, thought Camley, for the paddling old thing looked strange and jittery, and his mottled eyes looked everywhere but into Camley's. "Have you any other guests?" he asked. "2 at present, but both happen to be away on business at the moment. This is the bathroom." Camley, after cursory examination, decided the bath wanted a wash a good deal more than he did, and a geyser was clearly qualified to be a museum piece. "Well," he said, "I'll get along and fetch my things. I'll be back in about an hour." The old man gave him a key and saw him out. On leaving the house, Camley glanced up at it. It was situated on a short street between Northcote Road and Clapham Common, and was constructed of that peculiarly horrid, dirty white, slightly glazed brick prevalent in that neighbourhood. It had a look of hang-dog stability and permanence. Better, thought Camley, the jerry-built pimples and modernity, the juster places and the new homes, which had the decency to be almost as unstable as sandcastles, to be levelled by a few waves of years, than these rows of little bastilles. As, with the assistance of the taxi-driver, he was humping his trunk up the stairs, Camley breathed deeply of that lodging-house essence which haunts the memory far more pungently than the scent of wood smoke on an autumn evening. He tried to analyse it. Imagine, he thought, a very large and shaggy sheepdog had rifled the contents of a fried fish shop and then trotted home through pouring rain and laid down in the hall to dry, exhaling vigorously. That would account for 2 of its ingredients. If a good stock of mice and a large head of cockroaches were at large on the premises, that would give you a 3rd. And then there was suggestion that a gentle breeze was blowing over an ancient trunk full of decaying raiment and a moth-riddled stuffed heron. He found this bouquet diluted but still pervasive in his room. He had intended to unpack immediately, but to his mild surprise he found his will placed a rigid veto on this proposal. "No, you don't," it seemed to proclaim, almost with the coda. "Wait and see." Oh well, he was tired, and weariness imposed odd prohibitions. Besides, he was not yet properly broken in to the corollaries of his penury. He got out enough for the night, put a bob in the meter, after awful gropings in a dark cupboard, sat down before the gas fire, yawned, and ruminated again, and for the 100th time, on his past, present, and future. He was aged 28, and 3 months before had occupied an 8-room flat mildly renowned for its interior decorations, in Mayfair, and spent rather more than £3,000 a year on his personal delectation in a robustly decorative way, and practised the art of painting for a dilettante 12 hours a week. However, the solicitor who had charge of his trust funds had decided to employ them in something younger and gayer than trusty securities, and lost the lot in the metal market. So he retired to Wandsworth, and Camberley to Clapham. He had been lucky to get a job with a firm of commercial artists, and was starting work the next day. And just as the sour soldier found to his indignation that on reaching the front he had not only to fight for his king and country, but also for his bleeding life, so now Camberley found he had to paint and draw for his. Well, he could make it. Make £1 do far, far more than its share of what 10 had done before. But there were many mental adjustments, coarse and subtle, necessary before he could acquire the poor man's angle of vision. He'd got to accustom himself to this one room, for example. He glanced around it in the gathering gloom, and was suddenly assailed by a gust of intense depression. It was pretty grim, so hideous, utterly wrong, as aloof and inhuman as a prison cell, somehow sinister, echoing many sad thoughts and desperate anxieties. He shivered, then shook himself. You mustn't let it get him down. Half an hour in a prison cell would teach him the difference. Really, he was lucky. Why didn't they charge more for it? He turned on the light, dozed over a book for a while, and presently decided he was hungry. Sleepily he looked round for a bell, then smiled wryly. There was to be no more of that. He got up and stretched himself. How quiet it was, almost tomb-like. Nothing was so quiet as a London backwater in its own melancholy way. He turned out the gas, lit a cigarette, put on his hat and coat, switched off the light, and opened the door. As he went out, he could see a faint reflection of himself made by the glow of his cigarette, or the faint light from the landing, in the wardrobe mirror opposite. As he went downstairs, he frowned as though vaguely puzzled, for it seemed to him there had been something a tiny bit odd about that reflection he had faintly glimpsed, but he could not put, as it were, the finger of his mind's eye upon it. He walked to the junction and dined bravely off some shepherd's pie and cheese, which inclined him to take a less picturesque view of the pastoral life, but the bill was 1 shilling, and he had all the convert's zeal for economy. It had been his intention to go straight home, but he felt a very strong distaste for the prospect, and instead took a walk around the dread wastes of Wandsworth Common. Then, to his shame, he felt abominably hungry again. He found an all-night cafe, and ate one of those pies which, screened by beans, form a good part of the staple diet of a certain percentage of the populace, and the contents of which their makers are sworn by huge oaths and mighty covenants never to betray. "Bill, please, waiter!" exclaimed a facetious and slightly cast hobbledehoy further along the counter. Camberley realised this shaft of wit was aimed at him, and meditated removing a block, a feat he was quite capable of accomplishing, and would have enjoyed. But no, he thought, I'll take it as a compliment. Obviously, I don't look the part of Lazarus yet. Damn it, I never will. Fortified by this resolution, he strode resolutely to number 10. It was pitch dark inside, and he hadn't the vaguest idea where the light switch was. He struck a match, and by its initial flare saw a large dog slink away down the passage. It turned its head for a moment, and Camley could see the twin gleams of its tawny eyes. That probably accounts for ingredient 1, he thought. I wonder how many more unhoovered hounds the old devil keeps. Just before he reached the landing, his match went out. He lit another and looked up. "Sorry, sir," he exclaimed, and then swore at himself. Apologizing to one's shadow! How occidental, oriental! I'll bury the pooish. But somehow the silence and the fetid gloom, the baleful glare of the beast, and that little futility had withered his momentary self-confidence. His room breathed chill, yet airless, and he received an impression that someone had been there shortly before, one of those odd little ripples, so irrational, so powerfully persuasive from, perhaps, some central secret. He turned on the gas and looked for evidences of this person's presence. He found none. He then went to the bathroom for some hot water and found it locked. An infernally puny piece of stinginess, he thought angrily. So he dug the kettle out of the cupboard and heated some water on the bracket. Another dreary little corollary of 12 6 a week. He undressed and 10 minutes later set his alarm clock for 7:30 and got into bed. The fact that he had accomplished something, and that tomorrow would see him earning his living, and, marvellously lucky, at a congenial job, saved him from lying awake, as had been his custom for many weeks, and brooding almost agonizingly over his troubles. He was asleep within 5 minutes, but some time later found himself awake again under the uncertain impression that some sound had disturbed him. There it was, a short staccato rattle of his door, and a faint swish, as if something had been drawn across it, and then a sharp convulsive rattle again. That blasted dog, he thought. Go away, beat it, he exclaimed. He half dozed off and woke again. He then had an experience which he had known often before, especially in strange rooms. It was that he had become, as it were, disorientated, that he was lying in the wrong direction of the room, as though his bed had been slewed around. Of course he knew that once you sat up in bed the illusion vanished, but ever since he had been a small boy it had amused him to play up to such illusions for a time. He did so now. It seemed to him he was lying along the top wall instead of a side one. He found no difficulty in holding it. That is enough, he thought after a few moments, and sat up and rubbed his eyes. For he still found himself lying along the top wall. And then something else caught his attention. His clock had stopped its throaty, ponderous ticking. Blast it! He exclaimed. He had put a box of matches under his bed. He reached down for them and lit one. And there he was lying along the side wall. His clock was hammering placidly away. The time was 2:45. Camley closed his left eye and tapped his nose, a habit of his when puzzled. It must be those pies, he decided, the shepherd and his dogs. But my tummy must take vows of poverty and learn to like it as well as I. I must get some sleep. Only about 4 hours till the alarm goes. He sniffed. That stench is pretty fruity. There's the wet dog, the fried fish, and the rest of it. But now there's something added. What is it? It was pungent and sickly, but he couldn't place it. He'd call it ingredient X for the time being. He yawned, lay back, and the next morning it seemed he was roused by the most bestial of small sounds. An hour later he was in the hall. The old man was there before him, the small tyke at his heels. "Did you have a good night?" he asked in such a comically urgent way that Camley wanted to laugh. "Fairish, thanks," he replied. "You're very fond of dogs, aren't you?" he added pointedly. "Well, I've had this little fella 10 years," said the old man. I should feel lost without him. What about that big swine? Thought Camley. By the way, he said, do you always lock the bathroom door at night? A curious expression came over the old man's face. Camley attributed it, at that moment, to discomfiture had been detected in some petty parsimony. I never do, he muttered, his eyes on the floor. It was locked last night. It can't have been, but it sometimes sticks. I see, said Camley. Well, I must be off. He spent an anxious but reassuring day. He was given a short story to illustrate, and the roughs he submitted were well approved. The atmosphere of the studio was amicable, and when he left at 6, he knew that sense of tempered relief experienced by a batsman who, at a moment of crisis, sees double figures go up beside his number on the scoreboard. He dined with a friend in Soho, and put his key in the lock of number 10 as the clock was striking 1:45. Hell! He'd forgotten to locate that light switch. He fumbled through his pockets and discovered he'd no matches. Oh, well, he knew the way. The complete lack of cheer about such abodes in the early hours of the morning was impressive, he decided. To become entangled at this moment with the feet of a body hanging from the banisters would merely be a matter for a shrug of the shoulders. He stumbled and swore, That damnation dog again. He paused for a moment. How could a brute that size lie on one of the stairs? But his foot had certainly touched something soft. It must have been coming down or going up, and he'd clipped its muzzle or rump. Why didn't that old fool shut it in at night? He moved on up the stairs. As he reached the spot where he had apologized to his shadow, he stumbled again. What's the matter with this bloody place? He muttered. He switched on the light in his room, and then went to the bathroom. It was open. He went back to his room, and though he hadn't meant to go to bed at once, sat down for a time considering that short story, and of course at once had a far, far better idea for the full page. He took a paper and pencil and roughed it out. He glanced up at the clock. Almost 2. He must get to bed. Besides, he was damn cold. Never again would he be without matches. There might be a box in the bathroom. He went to see. Locked! Or stuck. He put his shoulder to it. Hello! There was someone in there. That was a footstep. Mr. or Mrs. presumably. Odd time for a bath, but there seemed to be a general tendency to reject the normal in this abode. Abode. Second time he'd used that word. He undressed quickly and got into bed, and presently awoke abruptly to full consciousness. Now that, he thought, had been an interesting example of the jumbled rehash dream, and not a pleasant one, for it had started by his getting the sack from his job. Well, not his job, but some job. Get out and stay out, that tough-looking bird had shouted, and he'd slunk back to number 10, and later on had gone to the bathroom for some reason. Ugh! There had been an atmosphere of profound, pitiless melancholy brooding over it all. The door rattled sharply. My God, that dog again. He'd let it have it. He jumped out of bed and made for the door, and banged into the table. How was that? Where was the door? Rather flustered, he groped round the room. The fireplace must be here, therefore the door was there. No, that was the bed. Blast and hell! Therefore the door must be in this direction. And he caught his ribs against the table again. He ran his hands along the walls, and suddenly touched the light switch. As he flicked it down, the room seemed to spin round as though it were on a revolving stage, and he realized the clock was ticking again. He stormed out of the door, furious and confused, though through this emotional fabric a tiny thread of fear was woven. Now he was on the landing, and there was nothing. He listened intently for a moment. No sound from the dog, but from the bathroom came a rather revolting little noise, a sort of hawking, choking cough. Senile guitar, he decided, as he went back to his room. He glanced at the clock. 2:45. did the old devil sleep in the bathroom? I'm not sure I shall be here very long, he said to himself, and he got back into bed. Though he woke with the alarm, he dozed off again, and this made him late, so he had no time to communicate his views on the large dog to his landlord. He spent another hard but satisfactory day, and did not leave the office till after 7. Not feeling very like Clapham at the moment, he dined at his club. He had paid the sub before his downfall, drowsed through a movie, was back at number 10 before 11. The light was still on in the hall. The bathroom door was unlocked, the large foul dog was not about, and Camley felt more kindly disposed towards his domicile. He had brought back some proofs of a novel, for which he read till 1, then folded them and put them on the table. For rather obvious reasons, Camley seldom referred in after life to his experiences in number 10. For one thing, he knew if he did, he would usually encounter the bland grin of unbelief. For another, recounting them evoked displeasing memories, for which, once evoked, took time to fade. But to one to whom he related them, he confided that from the moment he put down those proofs till 7 the same morning, 6 hours, his memory is, in a sense, unreliable. Once at Oxford he got extremely tight, and his memories of that night are similarly hazy. Certain incidents stand out translucently from the haze like atolls in the ocean, but their time order and sequence are uncertain, and he finds a difficulty in categorically deciding between appearance and reality. It was so also on this occasion. He finds it difficult to dogmatize and say, this was a dream, this an actual event. Sometimes he thinks he dreamed it all. He hopes he did. Sometimes he has an unhallowed suspicion that he was a subject, victim, of a new, to him, mode of apprehension. He dislikes this possibility intensely, for if he was a selected victim once, why not again? In any case, this is what he recalls. He had a certain dim recollection of undressing, but, as he puts it, the spell was already working then, and the details of that undressing are blurred and inarticulated. The next thing he thinks he remembers is sitting up in bed and hearing the door rattle violently again and again and again. He leapt out of bed, and as before lost his bearings, and dashed round and round the room in a sharply growing panic. At last he found the door, and flung it open. His right foot slipped as he did so. There was a strange dim light on the landing, and by it he could just see the body of the dog writhing, twisting and rolling from side to side. His foot, he saw, had slipped in a pool of blood. This discovery, he said, completely unnerved him. He rushed to the bathroom door and found it locked. He thumped on the panel, shouting, "Come out, whoever you are!" He flung his shoulder at the door and shouted again. And then he heard footsteps, and the door slowly opened. Out through it tottered a tall figure, naked above the waist. Its head was tilted back, its eyes pupilless, white blanks. Its arms were stretched out before it, as though groping for its way, and blood was pouring from its throat, which was gashed from ear to ear. Camley shrank back from it as it passed him and entered his room. Then he heard it crash down beside his bed. He woke in that bed, sweating, trembling and heart-racing. "Thank heavens!" he cried to himself. "It was only a dream." And then he smelt overpoweringly that terrible stench, ingredient X, and heard a movement beside his bed. "That accursed dog!" he thought, and stretched down his hands for the matches. His hand touched something before it should have done. It was hard and pointed. His fingers moved down and felt below to where something warm pulsed out, swelling up over his wrist. Camley has no doubt about the bona fides of his next experience. that of waking up abruptly at 7 o'clock and seeing a wintry light breaking through the dark blinds. In a flash he remembered. In 20 minutes he was dressed and packed, for he had to get out of that room. As he passed the bathroom door, he saw it was shut. As he reached the hall, the landlord was awaiting him. He was in his dressing gown, and Camley saw he was shivering violently. "Look here," said Camley, "I'm leaving you. I'll fetch my things this evening." "Very well," said the old man. "You don't seem very surprised," remarked Camley dryly. "No, sir." "When did it happen?"
3 years ago.
"And the dog?"
"Yes."
"You haven't any other guests, have you?"
"No, sir. I shouldn't have let them in here, but I hoped—"
"I understand. I suppose your wife is frightened."
"Yes, sir."
"I wonder you can stick it."
"It's all right during the day, sir, and unfortunately I own the house and cannot sell or rent it. It has a bad name."
"You've got enough to live on?" asked Camley sympathetically.
"Yes, sir."
"Well, I hope my successor will have stronger nerves or be a sounder sleeper."
"I shall not try again, sir."
"Well, I must be going," said Camley. "By the way, you've moved the bed since then?"
"Yes, sir,"
replied the old man, shaking from chin to knees. As Camley was having breakfast in a cafe near the junction, he thought miserably. "Now I shall have to begin den hunting all over again, and I know I shall never get anything like as good for 12 6. He smiled to himself. Anything like as good. Well, that's one way of putting it. He found a tolerable habitation the next day, but for some nights he hated turning out his light, and his sleep was disturbed. But the memories of the young are flexible and resilient, and within a month he had erected a barrier against those 3 days in number 10, and his will being reasonably strong, he crowded out the recollection of them with determined efficiency. But always in the back of his mind was a wish to solve the little puzzle. What had been wrong with that reflection he had seen in the wardrobe mirror? One evening, some years later, when he was sitting alone in his 5-guinea-a-week flat in St. John's Wood, he felt an impelling desire to settle this petty problem. He turned out the reading lamp by his side, cleared his head, and concentrated on revisualizing the scene. In about 5 minutes he was seeing every detail of that room, and then, as it were, he introduced himself into it, and set himself in motion. As before, he yawned, switched off the gas stove, picked up his hat and coat, and walked over to the door. Now for it! He switched off the light and glanced back in a fury of concentration, his eyes tightly closed. For a while nothing appeared, and then the ghostly outline of the wardrobe recreated itself. For a moment, that was all. He drew his eyes in, remained absolutely still, his heart thumping with the strain, and then, just as a film comes to life in the developer, the most tenuous image shone from the mirror, hardened, sharpened, and was there. He stared at it for 10 seconds in passionate absorption. All the time, as an accompaniment to this scrutiny, was the thought, how true it is we see what we expect to see. Then he could hold it no longer, and the image faded as it had come. Seen again, there were several little discrepancies, several little reasons why it was a suspect reflection of Mr. Philip Camley. And there was one which could rightly be considered decisive, for Camley had certainly been wearing a white collar round his neck on that occasion, and not what appeared to be a broad band of ribbon, which his colour sense told him was almost certainly red. The spectral memory of a certain sickly, pungent reek came faintly, remotely back to him. He switched on the light.